how would you define human trafficking?
Well, if I wanted to start with just the words you're saying, rather than getting into all of the details that I would think about with human trafficking first, we have human, so people, and trafficking, which we usually think about relating to transport or traveling. But one of the interesting things with human trafficking as well is we tend to add a bad meaning to it, even though those words themselves don't really have that in just the words.
There's nothing wrong with that. Trafficking, nothing wrong with that. And I would agree with that human trafficking is not inherently bad. It depends very much on the context. So, for instance, airplanes. You are, by definition, carrying a majority of people. I mean, there's other cargo that's on planes, including mail and luggage that is associated with the people, but really you are transporting the people, and we have air traffic control that controls the traffic that is carrying people. So that is, by a dictionary definition, a form of human trafficking. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
So what gives human trafficking a negative stigma?
Well, a great place to start would be looking at the people involved.
On which side?
The people being trafficked, the people
Okay.
traveling. We'll start there, because that's often the people that, at least I think of when I hear human trafficking. I think of somebody who is brought as a slave of some sort.
Okay. And human slavery, I think, is something that definitely deserves its own discussion. But let's assume for the moment, axiomatically, that slavery is bad.
Right.
Then we can then assume that human trafficking, as it relates to slavery, is also bad because it perpetuates that slavery.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're not really talking about a slave trade. What about the human trafficking related to that makes it particularly bad?
I think what it comes down to is at least the people didn't have a choice in many of these cases. Now, that's not all cases. There are definitely other things that we associate with human trafficking that aren't this way. For example, smuggling people.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're thinking about it from the slavery perspective, yeah, these people did not have a choice. Sometimes they were even convinced to do it. There was definitely somebody telling them, hey, I could get you this sweet job over there, but that didn't end up coming to fruition.
Kind of the convincing of economic migrants by nefarious individuals that people come voluntarily and maybe with legitimate promise, but are taken advantage of by other individuals in that trafficking endeavor.
Right.
And I think I know what you're referring to with what's going on in the Middle East and the migrant crisis in Europe, where people are being smuggled into the country, and there are human traffickers that they are literally being paid by the people that they're trafficking to cross the Mediterranean or cross, I think, from Turkey and overland to be able to make it into the EU in Europe, looking for economic opportunity.
Right.
So
on the surface, that sounds like a great thing. If they actually found jobs and all that in Europe, well, paying this person to help them get over doesn't sound so bad.
Sure. It seems very similar to a person paying a pilot to fly them over to a new country or fly them to a new location. They may move for any number of reasons, including economic opportunities. It's one of the reasons that you go to a different country is because your work demands it, or you see an opportunity in that country that wasn't in your home country. And in particular, people coming from Africa and the Middle East, they're looking for a better life and better opportunities, and a lot of those exist in Europe. So are human traffickers that move people from those poorer countries into Europe bad? Because they are doing human trafficking, but it's voluntary.
Right, and that's what makes it tricky is it is voluntary. In theory, the people are getting the good that they paid for. It's not like the smuggler is doing anything wrong in that regard. They said, hey, I'm going to take you to Europe.
And assuming that they follow through on that with the expectation it's a free market solution. I pay you money, and I know that it sounds like some of the smugglers, from reports of people that have gone over there and spoken to some of the traffickers, both the traffickers and traffickees, it sounds like we'll pay you money, and we'll even have a guarantee that it'll only cost you that much regardless of the number of attempts to get you into the country. So it's like there's even some respectable business practice going on. So is that okay?
Right. Because if you think about it from the economic perspective, that totally sounds fine. But
even from a humanitarian perspective, trafficking people from one country to another for the purpose of economic opportunity is good.
Right. I think in the case of Europe, especially with these migrants from Africa and Middle East, they do think that there is a lot of opportunity in Europe, but they just don't have the skills in many cases to make it in Europe. So there's a disconnect here.
And I think a lot of them don't realize that the skills that they can bring are generally not very useful in the countries that they're going to. So in that case, while there are some respectable business practices that I guess you could say in terms of the business of human trafficking, as bad as that sounds, even having guarantees, you're still taking advantage of people who are already relatively poor, charging them reasonably large sums of money so that you can profit from it to move them to another country. You're taking advantage of a person's bad situation, misleading them in the opportunities that they may have in the new area, smuggling them in, and then just leaving them there to fend for themselves, which, to be fair, is not the human trafficker's business. Once they're there, their job is to get them from point A to point B. So you could argue that it's on the person who is being trafficked to know where they are going and exactly what they want to do. It's not on another person to tell them what's going on.
Right. But oftentimes these poor people, they may be ignorant of what they're getting into. Should we be protecting them from that?
And whose job is it to protect them from the nefariousness of the human traffickers?
Right, because these people who are doing the human trafficking, they're not going to be that nice, friendly-looking guy on the corner. They're more likely to be somebody who is involved in other illegal activities.
And it's kind of by definition, because if you're doing human trafficking and not going through official port of entry immigration, it's because you are intentionally breaking the law of the country that you're going to or coming from, depending on what type of nation it is. So you may be smuggling someone out of the country or smuggling someone into the country, but either way, the reason it's smuggling and human trafficking is because it's breaking a law. And I think that that's an important component of, as we develop this definition of human trafficking while we're having this conversation, I think that a portion of it is human trafficking has to be, at least with the negative stigma, has to be something that is illegal in one of the countries involved.
I can agree with that.
Whether it's right or wrong, whether the people are willing or unwilling, it should be something that is illegal in at least one of the countries involved. Fair?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that this is a really good example to bring up because some people do want to be trafficked, but other people don't want them to be trafficked. So that may be another component of what goes into the definition of human trafficking is movement of people from one place to another that is unwelcome by a human party involved. Either the people doing the trafficking, the people being trafficked, or the country where they're coming from, or the country that they're going to. Is that another fair component?
I think so.
So I'm thinking let's go through some examples. We've been talking very much about the immigration crisis in Europe, where people are voluntarily going, but they're being taken advantage of by traffickers. By the traffickers just not really telling them exactly what's going on or not caring enough to find out. They may not even be acting nefariously. Maybe they think that they actually are doing good and helping these people get over and have a better opportunity, but not following up on whether or not those traffickees are successful in their endeavors.
Right. To be fair, though, it's not like the traffickers have any incentive to follow up.
Right, because they get their money and they're trying to use that money to move more people over and help more people. So I think we can probably assume in this case that the traffickers, even if there is a nefarious intent that they're just doing it for self-benefit, there are probably at least some people that legitimately want to help people coming from their own country and get them to a new place. And to give them the benefit of the doubt, let's assume that they're doing it for good, while there will be people who are doing it for nefarious reasons. But that's for literally any endeavor. The fact that it's illegal makes it more likely that it's for a nefarious purpose, but it's not certain. And I don't think that it changes the immorality of what they're doing because they're bypassing the laws.
Right.
If you feel that the laws are unjust or oppressing the people and preventing them from having opportunity in the country that they're trying to go to, is human trafficking, in this case, a way of circumventing the law in an attempt to attain a moral good?
I mean, to a point. Part of the problem there, though, is why were the laws there in the first place? To prevent you from coming in.
Doesn't matter.
I mean, if the people in that country don't want you there, that says a lot about what you would be going into.
What if the laws have been on the books for such a long time that no one really thinks about them?
And I think that's a very valid point, because oftentimes these laws around borders and entering a country have been around forever, and people don't revisit them.
And it can take a really long time to change laws, especially ones that are nationwide or continent-wide. In the case of Europe, those law changes are very, very slow to gain adaptation. And in the meantime, people are in economically poor or war-torn countries and need to get to a safe ground or a safe haven. If human trafficking is the way to do that, and going through human traffickers that are willing to smuggle them into the country illegally to give them those opportunities, you could view human traffickers as do-gooders or heroes of a sort. I realize that this is a very probably unpopular opinion, but they may legitimately be trying to do good.
Right. If they don't agree with the laws and they understand that, hey, these people are going to this country for a good reason, better life, it makes sense.
And they don't want to wait for the law to change because people are dying in the meantime.
Right. And they may never even see it change in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And I think that something like the U.S.-Mexico border is very similar. You see people piling into cars, 10, 15 at a time, cross the border, and then as soon as they're over the border, everyone piles out like a clown car and scatters because they're in the U.S. Even if they're paying the person to move them over, sometimes it's just a family that wants to go over, they get in a car, as soon as they're over, They scatter, try to get away from border patrol, and they're in the new country. So it is a form of human smuggling and therefore human trafficking. So in that case, human trafficking can be good from the point of view of the people being trafficked and going from one place to another. Granted, it is also wrong in the sense that it is by definition, at least the definition that we're following, unwelcome for the receiving party. And that's why they had to resort to human trafficking, is because they were already from the start unwelcome, and you're forcing yourself on another group of people. And this is one of the reasons that we're having this discussion right after the immigration discussion, the borders and immigration discussion, is because they're very related, because human trafficking is usually between borders or over borders. So in that case, are human traffickers inherently good if the people being trafficked are willing, and the reason that they're doing the trafficking is because they disagree with the laws of the country, either that they're going into or coming out of in the case of authoritarian or negatively viewed regimes?
I think in the case of them actually disagreeing with the laws, I could agree with you on that, because it's almost a form of peaceful protest in a way. It's not like they're hurting anybody doing this.
They're not actively hurting anyone. They're trying to keep the people that they're moving across safe, and they get paid because they move people. And if people all of a sudden start dying or being unsuccessful, or if you die in the process or get captured in the process, you stop making money. You stop being able to have people come over.
Right. So from that perspective, it's not too bad.
All right. So human traffickers are good. All right. Good episode. I think we'll call it there. Obviously not.
But that does bring into question intent. Does the intent of the smuggler matter?
Interesting. So if again, going with this case of willing participants going to or from an unwilling country, I think let's stick with to an unwilling country. The human trafficker, if they only want to do it for the purpose of profit and take advantage of the people as much as they can, is that bad?
I mean, do you blame them?
No.
Right. So it's not.
They frequently are coming from a similar situation where they don't have much money and they want to be able to make money for whatever reason, possibly helping out family. And a way to do that is take people who do have money, help them get something that they view is worth a certain amount of money. If it costs, I think some of the numbers that were being thrown around recently were $2,000 to $5,000 to go from somewhere in northern Africa into southern Europe. If someone has that money and they're willing to pay it without extortion, they're saying, yep, I will pay you this much money to move me over there. That's what I view as being worthwhile for this trip. It's voluntary exchange, regardless of the intent. It's voluntary. Even if it's for a nefarious purpose and they just want to become rich off of people, that's kind of the whole point of capitalism is you want to become rich and money comes from other people.
Exactly. So they just have a different intent than the ones who are doing it because they disagree with the laws. But I don't know that it really changes their position very much.
The act is the same.
Right. And in the case of them earning money, you know, they're often in a poor country already. They probably need this money for their own family.
And for instance, just to go off of the idea of an act, let's say in a country where homosexuality is still illegal, and at the time of this recording, it is still illegal, very much so, in Russia. If Russia makes homosexuality legal, but not because the government actually believes it's legal, but because they want to get support from the people to be reelected and maintain their power in government. It's for a nefarious purpose, but homosexuality would then be legal. That's a good thing. Many would argue not, but
we can assume it's a good thing for our purposes here.
Right. Assuming that it's a good thing, does the intent behind the act matter? And I think that not really, unless you're actively doing things that end up hindering the process. So for instance, if you're doing it for the purpose of making money and you are stopping short and not delivering them to their end location for the purpose of making money and not delivering on your promise, then it starts to become more questionable because you're starting to break the ethics of capitalist agreements, let's say.
Right. And part of the unfortunate thing there, too, is if the smuggler doesn't follow through on everything, say they drop you off at an island in the middle of the Mediterranean rather than the coast where they said that they were going to take you.
How are you going to hold them accountable?
Right. It's not like you can go to the police.
So I think that part of the other problem with human trafficking is that they aren't answerable to anyone.
But that does bring an interesting point of, could we make them answerable to people?
The countries that have a problem with it can crack down. And we're seeing that with several of the countries in Europe right now where they're really cracking down on immigration. I believe Italy is actually securing their ports that, oh, you have a ship? We don't recognize the ship. You're not docking. Because they don't want to have further waves of illegal immigration coming onto their shores. So, yes, you can crack down on the human traffickers by enforcing the laws that are on the books. But again, that's not going to stop all the human traffickers because some of them, they're saying, well, this is a protest against the laws that we view as unjust.
Right, and it might just make them more creative so that they're harder to catch.
Yep, we see that at the U.S.-Mexico border. People tend to get very creative in ways that they smuggle people over. And that's again, an idea of, I don't agree with the immigration laws that you have. There's another way that I can do it. This person is going to help me do it. They're going to traffic me over. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong from the people that are doing it. So being trafficked or even paying traffickers to move them from one location to another, largely because they may not know what they're getting into. It's not necessarily their fault. We'd ideally like them to know what they're getting into, whether or not the country is welcoming, and what opportunities they would face. And the traffickers can use it as a protest. So it is morally justifiable to do that sort of trafficking. Are there any holes in that argument? And the not just the intent, but the enforceability of it comes from the fact that it's illegal, and if you want to stop it from happening, then you have an obligation to stop immigration or stop the trafficking. And if you don't stop it, then people will come to your country, and if you really don't care about it, then you should probably change the laws on the books. But if you don't agree with the laws and the people are not coming over, it is on the side of the country that is saying no and is declining, that they should be the ones stomping down on the human trafficking.
And I think that's reasonable for the receiving side to be the one that has to stop it. But part of the problem there, too, is just enforcement. How are you going to find these people?
True, and that's one of the reasons that having, for instance, a border wall is really, really helpful. Or having a way of enforcing the border, or funneling people from a large area into a small area so that you have a higher likelihood of detecting human traffickers. And if you do, you can then capture them and say, and interrogate them, figure out what's going on. When I say interrogate, I mean question. I don't mean beat. You can ask them questions, figure out what they're doing, and figure out if there is nefarious intent, figure out if they have been negligent. And that way you can protect the individuals that are being smuggled so that you can at least deport them back or handle them in a humane manner rather than letting the trafficker go free and potentially do more harm.
Yeah, and I think that could work at least for, smuggling somebody who wants to be in another country. But what about those cases where somebody doesn't want to be there? They were coerced, maybe because they thought that they were going to have a really good job, and then they get there and their passport is taken from them and they're forced to be a slave.
So into a country so in this case, not from a poor country to a rich country, but from a poor country to another poor country, and being misled to a new poor country that ends up putting them into a worse situation because they can't go anywhere, they're undocumented, and now they just disappear.
Right.
So that seems agreeable that is not acceptable because you are actively coercing people to do something, actively lying about it, and it ends with the person being in a worse situation. But is that any different than going to a rich country and not having opportunities versus going into a poor country, not having any opportunities, and being put into slavery? Because in the one case, as a slave, you are enslaved, but someone is actively taking care of you. In the rich country, and you're just out in the street, no one is taking care of you. So arguably, the slavery option might be better.
Might. Part of it depends on your conditions, though, as that slave. If you're more in a domestic situation, that's very different than if you were a sex slave.
Which also may be in a domestic condition, but I understand your meaning. It's difficult because also, what are the conditions in the poor country? Is it hot and is it out in the middle of a desert versus in a richer country where maybe it's a more temperate zone? Just the conditions themselves may be different. But again, what we're talking about is the intent and result. That if you have a nefarious intent as a trafficker, and the result is a person being homeless and or enslaved, does that make a difference whether or not they end up enslaved? Because being homeless or being indentured to the whims of the country that you're in, that is kind of a form of slavery. That you aren't a citizen, so you may not have the rights of a citizen, and you have whatever rights they deem you are worthy of. It's another form of slavery. I know that a lot of people usually think of slavery as you're doing hard labor or you're doing this or that, but In the case of criminals that work, similar thing. If you're arrested or put in jail, you are prevented from living your life in the way that you want, which is a form of slavery. Again, slavery is usually associated with work. So is it equivalent, since the end result may be similar and intent may be similar, whether or not the person goes to a poor country or to a rich country?
I mean, that depends somewhat on the conditions that they're in, like we were talking about. If you were homeless in a rich country, that is very different than being homeless in a poor country, that's for sure. In a rich country, there might be more social programs to help you out. People might be more willing to give you money as well. I don't necessarily love the idea of begging, but you are more likely to get something.
And there's more money to be had in rich countries.
Right. Whereas in the poor country, it's not going to be great. There isn't going to be a lot of money to give you if you could get anything at all. And there probably aren't going to be a lot of resources for you. There's not going to be a homeless shelter. You're probably just going to have to make a shack out of cardboard if you can't even find any.
So would it be better if the human trafficking were noticed? So for instance, going to a rich country or a country that has secure borders, they can crack down on human trafficking and stop it in its tracks, which, like we said earlier, may arguably be bad because people are looking for opportunities, but at least it's monitored, that there has been an active decision that is made by someone who's in a reasonable enough position to think about the decision that's being made. In this case, the government, that they're involved in that decision. Versus if you're going from a poor country to a poor country where the only people involved are the traffickees and the traffickers, there's really no monitoring of that. So does monitoring people's lives and exactly what they're doing and where they're moving and when they're moving, does that make it more moral?
I mean, when you put it that way, that just sounds terrible because I don't want people to know everywhere I'm going.
Sure, and that's the whole purpose of trafficking, is to make sure that you don't know where people are going. So is increasing monitoring a way of making human trafficking more moral, because the only human trafficking that would remain is positive human trafficking, but in that case, it's just moving people from place to place. A whole portion of the definition is that human trafficking is something that is inherently illegal, regardless of the intent. But
Right.
The fact that it's illegal in at least one of the countries means that you have someone monitoring the human trafficking and trying to limit it and prevent people from going from a bad situation to a worse situation. In an unmonitored situation, does that mean that is it even human trafficking in that case? Because if no one is there to stop it or decline the human trafficking, you may be going from a bad situation to a bad situation, or moving with all parties being voluntarily involved, is from a poor country to a poor country, even if it ends in a bad result, is the act of moving the people inherently immoral?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to put somebody through that, especially if the person being trafficked was expecting something better. But the government in this poor country that you're sending people to, if they're not cracking down on human trafficking, then nobody's out there saying no.
Then it's just assisted migration.
Right. Which there really isn't anything inherently bad about that.
And I don't think that there's anything immoral about it, in the sense that people want opportunities. A lot of the time, those opportunities fall through and people end up in a worse situation. That's literally part of living. You do what you think is right, and you do the best with the information that you have at the time. And very frequently, that does not end well. Particularly in poor countries, you just don't have many opportunities. You don't have many options. So a lot of the options that you're going to take are going to end poorly. Moving and migrating is one of those that very well may end poorly, and the human traffickers may not know that.
Right, and it's not necessarily that different of a choice to other things when you're that poor. Back in your home country, you might be stealing to get food. So would even just the chance of being out of that situation be a reason to get out of there?
And the human traffickers may just be trying to move them to a new location, without the knowledge of the government, but if the government in one of the countries doesn't really care, then you're just assisting people in moving in the hopes of a better situation. And in reality, I mean, that's what people have been doing for thousands of years, traveling around, trying to find new lands or new opportunities in somewhere else besides where they are, because they know that it's not working for them where they are. And in that regard, assisting in that migration for the purpose of looking for a better life, that's what America was founded on.
Right. So there's nothing really bad about that.
I would contend that there is a possibility of having a very high good. Again, with the fact that moving people voluntarily is something that the United States was founded on, and going along with the theme of having one party involved being unhappy about this, Native American population. They were displaced. They were in the United States first, or the land that the United States now occupies, they were there first. They did not appreciate the new people coming over, and there have been wars fought for several hundred years about that. But people were trafficked from one location to another location, going to the United States in hopes of setting up a good civilization, looking for a better life. They found people who, while some were cooperative and some were welcoming, many were not. And regardless of that intent, they were displaced and ended up having very negative situations moving forward. So, and that's one of the arguments that people will make, is that the founding of the United States was immoral because people were already living on the land that the migrants moved to. So that's, I think most people would agree that the United States has done a lot of good for the world, both in terms of technological development, the spreading of democracy to a large number of nations, which has lifted a lot of people out of poverty and into better lives with longer life expectancy. So is the result of the human trafficking and displacement of the Native Americans, was that arguably good because it was with good intent, with a good result, but also with a negative result?
Right. Part of the interesting thing about that, too, is nobody knew what the United States would grow into at the time. There were a lot of different paths it could have taken.
And the people that were doing the trafficking may have thought, oh, they're Native Americans. Okay, well, yes, there were some people that said, oh, we need to kill all the savages. There were also people that got along with them very well. I mean, that's what Thanksgiving is supposed to be about, is getting along with the people that were natively there. And we could have merged the cultures. There were a lot of people that did start merging the cultures and did marry Native Americans when they had come over from another country. So you don't know where it was resulting. It was with a good intent. Many times it was also with negative intent sometimes, but people moving. And people will move from one location to another. So is the act of enabling that motion inherently bad? And it sounds like everything that we're discussing, no, the facilitation of human movement is not inherently bad, even if it's illegal or if one of the parties involved doesn't like it.
Right. Because it's really hard to draw that line between what would be bad moving of people and good. You know, I pay a pilot to fly me home for Christmas, and people would argue that's pretty good. I get to see my family. I get to take a vacation. And is that really that much different than someone paying a smuggler to help them get into the country?
Looking for a better opportunity. And I'll change the example a little bit. Let's say you work for a company and they say you need to travel. If you want to keep your job, you have to move halfway across the country and work over there. Do you have to stay in that job? No. Is the company coercing you into moving to a new location? Yes. Are they coercing you with the promise of money or opportunity and continued employment? Yes. And they'll pay for you to move to that new location. Okay, so it's a different direction of money flow, but it's also, we promise you money in the future if you move now. And they may even say, like, we'll give you a discount by just taking a portion of it out of your paycheck and you move over there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a better life. Maybe the reason they wanted to move you there was because no one actually wants to work there. They can't find people to hire out there.
That's a pretty common thing.
And they may put you into a really bad situation, and it is a company taking advantage of a person that's in an economically unideal circumstance for the benefit of the company. Is that different than people in the Middle East trafficking people?
I mean, in some ways it is, because you tend to have more choices if you're in that kind of situation where your company's going to move you. That can mean that you are pretty valuable to your company. So if you were to look for employment elsewhere, you might actually end up with more money.
So having choices changes how negatively we can view the trafficking.
Right. Although I know in some cases in the Middle East, you don't necessarily have choices.
Which is part of the problem of, does where you're coming from affect the morality of the movement? In other words, if you don't have many choices, does that mean that the trafficking is immoral because, oh, you're just taking advantage of someone who doesn't have choices? Versus, oh, well, they have choices. You can go ahead and take advantage of them. Arguably, that's worse. Permitting the taking advantage of people versus, well, there's nothing else they can do. Do what you can.
Right. Because at least if you do what you can, then the person that's moving will get something out of it.
You're making an attempt. Regardless of whether or not it fails, people were already failing where they're coming from. And if you're in a country that has opportunities, well, you're saying, okay, well, you should move. And then you may be taking advantage of it. So it could be arguably less moral to do it in a country where you have opportunities and you then take advantage of the people, coercing them to move and forcing the migration, rather than in a country where there are no other options. It's like, this is what we have.
But in a country with options, isn't it economically better for the company to try to move somebody that they already have?
Assuming that that's cheaper than finding someone new and just training them on location. Yeah.
So even though the company is coercing you, it could work out better in the long run, and the company has a good reason for it.
Yeah. And it could benefit both sides. In that case, it could benefit the company, could benefit the person. They're still employed. Yeah, they're living in a new location, but it's also just new opportunities and a new place to live. Maybe you will actually find that things are better. You may find that they're worse. But in either case, it's very similar to the examples of people in poor countries that don't really know what they're going to get, but they're hopeful, and it's an option. And the execution of that option, or the attempt of taking that option, is not bad. The people doing it and the people facilitating it, the traffickers, are trying to make that a thing. That is arguably a moral good. And I was not expecting to make this argument. And again, we don't plan out how these conversations are going to go. And I think this is a perfect example of that, because I was very much on the, in the last episode, on the closed borders, or at least a managed border part of the argument. And now it's like human trafficking, where you actively try to ignore those borders to bring about social change, is good.
Right.
That the motivations behind it tend to be good, from at least as long as the involvement is voluntary.
Right. I think the voluntary part is key.
Yes. That the people being trafficked need to be voluntary participants. If they are not voluntary participants, does that change the question? I think that that's what we should probably start getting into now. What happens when the people are involuntary participants?
Well, that makes things a bit more difficult, and I would definitely call it immoral because the people didn't consent to this.
So, to me, Trail of Tears comes up.
Right. That is a great example. Some other ones could be folks living in a poor country where they are taught, oh, you could come with us for the night and you can have a good time. And then they're drugged and brought somewhere else and used for some sort of slavery or something along those lines.
Trafficking that results in slavery The trafficking isn't necessarily bad, but the result is of slavery. Slavery
Right.
being the portion of that that's bad.
Right. Assuming slavery is bad.
Yes. Again, assuming that as an axiom, yeah. The slavery is the portion that's bad, not the human trafficking.
Right. And most of the time, if you are going involuntarily, that's why.
Sure. In the case of the Trail of Tears, it was a displacement. And they weren't really trafficked. They were just guided, maybe, that, hey, go in this direction and keep walking for the purpose of taking land.
Right. But they didn't really have a choice in it. And there were people helping them along.
There were also people pushing them along, which arguably the fact that it was negatively affecting people or negatively affecting the people that were being moved is a negative in the human trafficking question.
Right.
What about in the case of war, where two countries are fighting each other? Is that considered human trafficking? People are being displaced by force from another group, and from both sides potentially. If both sides are trying to expand into the other territory, usually it's one side expanding into the other. So is it always the country that is doing the expanding? Does the fact that they are doing expansion into a country that is or an area that is already occupied, is that inherently immoral?
I mean, they are sending people from their homes involuntarily.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the people don't really want to raise a family in a place that's war-torn, which definitely limits their options to most likely running. But do we actually want to call that trafficking? Or is that something different?
And that's a good question. I think that trafficking more implies the guided motion of people from one location to another, as opposed to the stealing of land and the acquisition of land. And I think that goes more along with the lines of borders and expansion and really just war. So maybe we're just getting off topic here with the idea of expansion. But again, it's good to at least think of it, because moving in and displacing a large number of people seems to me different than trafficking a large number of people from one location to another.
Right. It seems like a key component of trafficking is there is some trafficker involved in some capacity, somebody who is helping you get to your destination.
So then, if that is not considered human trafficking, then that means that we haven't found an example of human trafficking yet that is inherently immoral, with the exception of human trafficking for the purpose of ending in slavery. But the slavery is the part that's wrong about that, not the trafficking itself.
Right.
So is there an instance of human trafficking that is involuntary, that is immoral, that isn't just displacement of people? I think I have an example. This is something that happens at the U.S.-Mexico border. People will take a child, potentially kidnap them, move them across the border, claim them as their own child to use as an anchor in the United States. And this is one of the problems that has actually been coming up with the migration crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border, is the fact that there have been thousands of people that are being trafficked over involuntarily, kids, because they can't consent to this type of thing, and parents or adult individuals that aren't their parents are trying to use the kid as an excuse to anchor themselves in the new country.
That's definitely immoral for a whole bunch of reasons.
The kidnapping, the using of children who can't consent to it. But even then, it may be because they're looking for better opportunities and a way of getting to the new country, and you're taking the kid along with you. Granted, you took them away from their parents. It's an involuntary transfer, and I think that is an example of human trafficking, or using humans for the purpose of trafficking from individuals from one location to another, that I think is immoral.
I can agree with that, because there are so many problems there. taking the child away from their family.
That's problem number one.
Right. Something we discussed in another episode with adoption, where it's hard for that child to bond with another family and they have a lot of behavioral problems. You've got that going on, so maybe the life of the child isn't any better, even though they came to what is arguably a better country.
And that's the second problem, is that the problem of the fact that the parents are now out the child is likely not going to have as good of a life, especially because they're being taken advantage of. Third, the child can't consent to that, even if their parents weren't aware of it or maybe were aware of it. The child can't consent to this, so you're inherently taking advantage of them, and it's for the risk. They can't consent to the risk because they don't understand the risk, because the people doing it don't understand the risk of, well, what if the country that I'm going to ends up not being good?
Right. And there's no way a child can understand those risks. Oftentimes it is a very dangerous journey in the first place. You're going across the desert.
Here's a question. What about the parent? What about if it is the parent? So let's assume that the child being moved is with a parent that legitimately wants what's good for them and what's good for their kid. And so then they're going to try and cross the border. They are moving their kid who can't consent to the move and breaking the law in the process. Is the moving of that child, because the child inherently can't consent, but the parent can, and the child is under the protection of the parent, does that mean, is this an example where the human trafficking of the parent being the trafficker while the child can't consent because they're unable to because of their age, an example of human trafficking without the consent of the trafficked person that is moral?
I think so, because in these cases, the parent is looking for what's best for the kid most of the time. I'm not going to say all the time, because I know that there are going to be outliers. But the parent's looking out for the kid. At least in court systems, the parent stands in for the kid in many cases. They have guardianship over their child. So they can somewhat consent for their child, even though it's not necessarily what the child wants.
I think one of the other problems is that frequently the conditions that need to be gone through to traffic from one country to another, to move from one country to another, in this case, again, sticking with the U.S.-Mexico border, we've seen several instances recently of parents trying to take their kids across the Rio Grande or other bodies of water and then drowning in the process. Mediterranean, same thing is happening. People are drowning in the process, sometimes with children. The children did not consent to this. They can't consent to this. Even if the parents want it, they're putting them at huge risk, more so than in many cases than just staying in the home country, because you're not putting them at risk of going through the desert or across a large body of water or in risky situations that are necessary because of the fact that it's illegal. So you're putting them into the human trafficking area, and you are actively putting them at a high level of risk, a risk of loss of life that the child can't consent to.
But that also raises a good point of, should the parents' wants go above the child's? Because if the parent wants to go to the United States for better opportunities, they can't exactly leave their kid in Mexico very well.
That would arguably be worse, just leaving an orphan on the streets, as opposed to trying to take them along with and rolling the dice, making an attempt at a very risky situation. Which
right.
arguably is what humans have done for most of human history is, hey, we're going to sail halfway across the world, hope that we go to land that may or may not be there, and then hope that we can set up a settlement before we freeze to death. That's
Exactly.
not inherently immoral if those are the options that you have. Even if it's against the child's consent and they're being put at risk of death, it doesn't seem inherently immoral if those are the options that you have and the parent thinks about it and deems it a necessary risk.
Right. And I think the necessary risk is an important part.
Or is deemed and thought to be a necessary risk, given the knowledge that the person doing it has. And I think that that's an important distinction.
That's true. Because oftentimes people don't understand how hard it is to go through the desert. You need tons and tons of water, and civilization is quite a ways away. So when you're starting out, it may not seem that bad. So why not bring your kid?
You obviously wouldn't want to leave them behind. And on the flip side, where there's plenty of water, out in the ocean, there's too much water and you can drown. So, yeah, it's just management of risk, and humans manage risk all the time. So even though the kid can't consent, if someone consents and there is a good reason in the case of a child, that the child's consent is usually defaulted to the parent or the guardian, as long as they are the actual parent or guardian, there's nothing inherently immoral about that because they're just seeking a better life.
Right, and you can't fault them for that.
And this is, again, assuming that the human trafficking has a positive intent. Now, is there an example where, for instance, a parent tries to move a child from one location to another with negative intent? I guess one example would be sex trafficking, which is a legitimate problem. But again, that's the problem is the result of that.
Right. You know, especially in the case of a parent moving their child to the U.S. and using the child as kind of a way to stay in the U.S., that's also somewhat the result of the trafficking as well, not inherent to moving the child.
And in the case of using a child as an anchor child, the question then becomes really, it's the moral question of, is using a child for the purpose of gaining citizenship to a country immoral? And that's a completely different question outside of the context of human trafficking, because the child may be trafficked in the process and the person may try to smuggle themselves into the country. They are trafficking themselves. That is a different question, because it begs the question of, what are you allowed to get out of your child? What advantages is a parent allowed to get out of their child, which is a completely different topic.
But probably a good one for another episode.
Possibly, yeah. Which leaves us again at, are there examples of human trafficking that are immoral? The kidnapping is obviously immoral, but it's, again, the kidnapping, and it's an example of human trafficking that starts immorally. You're kidnapping a child, moving them to a new location, and then you don't really care what happens with them. And actually, the really bad thing is that in the case of the U.S.-Mexico border, some of these children are trafficked back and used again as a, for instance, ticket of entry that, oh no, I have a child with me. You can't do anything with me. And they're using that as an excuse, and the child just keeps going back and forth for the purpose of smuggling people in. And it's really unfortunate for the child that is literally just being used as a ticket.
Yeah, that's nuts. I didn't even know that was a thing.
It is a thing. And it's one of the reasons, for people that are bringing up the idea of, children shouldn't be separated from their parents at the border. There's a problem in the sense that, how do you know that the children that they're coming with are actually their children? And when you have children that are being reused for the purpose of smuggling people in, you need to verify that before you just let people go, even back into the country that they came from, because you want to find the parent of the kid. So I think that is probably the best example of very immoral human trafficking that we have, is using of children for the purposes of human trafficking. That regardless of the intent, if you're trying to get even if you have a scheme of trying to get adults from one location to another, regardless of the intent of that, you are using a child for justification of that. That is wrong, because the child can't consent to being used in that way. They're not old enough to. And even if the parent is okay with it, you are selling your child for the purpose of trafficking people.
Right. That also gets into an interesting point, though. Is it because I sold my child to be used for trafficking people?
Or if they were kidnapped.
Right.
Regardless of whether or not, let's say the parent said, yes, I am okay with my child being used as a ticket of entry, if you will, into a new country. I'm okay with that. And they grant consent for the child. We were talking about earlier, the child's consent defaults to the parent's consent. The parent consents to that, to be used for the trafficking of adults. Is that acceptable, or does it make the entire act of that trafficking enabled by the child wrong?
I kind of want to say it's wrong because you're using a child.
For self-benefit.
Right. And the child doesn't really get anything out of it.
They're fed, kept alive. Maybe they're promised that once they're 18 and have more self-consent capabilities, that, hey, we'll give you some money. And maybe that's why the parents consent to it. And again, I don't know whether or not this is actually happening. I just know that children are kidnapped or taken advantage of multiple times. That is something that's happening at the border. The question of, well, what deals are they getting out of it? I highly doubt that there's a deal that says, hey, after you've been doing this for 10 years, you'll get the X amount of money as a thank you. I don't think
right.
that's
It's
happening.
probably that their parents are getting something.
Either their parents are getting something and the child can't consent to it, or the child has been kidnapped.
Right.
And I think from the statistics that have actually come up about that, it's usually just that they've been kidnapped.
Which unfortunately isn't that surprising.
So it starts from something that's immoral, or that we're axiomatically saying it's immoral to kidnap, and even with the consent of the parent, using the child for the purposes of trafficking adults, even if it's for the aim of giving adults the opportunity in the country that they're moving to, you're taking advantage of a child.
Absolutely.
And I think that while it still depends on your moral structure of, is it okay to use a child in a way that is not directly harming them? You're putting them at risk. And that's arguably also bad. And I think that the fact that you are putting them at risk, making them do illegal activities that they don't have the capability of consenting to, for the direct benefit of the adults that you're moving, that is fairly definitively, given our axioms, immoral.
I could certainly agree with that one.
Whew. It only took about an hour to find an example of human trafficking that's actually immoral.
I didn't think it would take quite this long.
This feels really bad. This feels wrong. It shouldn't take that long to find an axiomatically backed immoral example of human trafficking. It's hard. It's significantly harder than I thought.
Right, because most of the time we think of the outcomes of human trafficking, not the actual moving of people.
Yes, and even the outcomes can be good because they give people opportunities. And even if they don't give people good opportunities, it's just more of that they weren't successful in that opportunity. It's still an attempt that's being made. I think it's the method is what the problem is. Being risky is not necessarily bad, because humans have been taking risks for all of human history.
Right, and we can't stop taking risks. Nothing new and interesting would happen.
Right. It's literally just whether or not the people can consent. If they consent to being moved, the act of human trafficking is not wrong. Let's try and throw a wrench in that. What about human trafficking where the source country is the one that doesn't consent? So, for instance, North Korea. And I don't think that trafficking is necessarily a problem, but North Korea, as I think we mentioned in the last discussion, will send people out to the Olympics. Like when they participate in the Olympics, all of the athletes that participated had a government official with them at all times to make sure that the person didn't just flee and not return back to North Korea. So it's an example, and this actually happens fairly frequently in communist countries, that they take a lot of effort to try to keep people in the country, because you're a communist nation. You need people to be able to be successful, and you need to have people work together. And if people leave, then you're losing resources. So arguably, trafficking people out of those countries, because their belief structure is that people must stay and help the community, trafficking people out of those locations hurts the people who are being left behind, regardless of the individual rights, because in communism, it's communal rights, not individual rights. So trafficking people out of those hurts the country that they're leaving, and hurts a lot of people. So from that moral perspective, trafficking is bad.
Right. That also brings up an interesting point, though, between the individual versus the group. Of course, if you recognize the group being more important than the individual, this makes total sense. But on the flip side, if you look more towards the rights of the individual, this doesn't sound great at all, because then you can never really escape a situation that could be terrible. You know, if you are in a country that, for example, criminalizes being gay, and you
like
are
Russia.
gay. Right. And
Since
you are
we're talking about communists.
and you're gay, well, you don't really want to be in that group.
And you would ideally like to find someone that can traffic you elsewhere or smuggle you elsewhere. And I think for most of this episode, we've been lumping trafficking with smuggling,
Right.
human smuggling specifically. And I think that that's a good example. You want to leave, but you maybe can't leave for whatever reason, particularly in communist nations where they actually do have protections against or limitations on people leaving, particularly in, for instance, Soviet Russia. They did not want people leaving. And I think I've mentioned the idea that in Soviet Russia, people would leave or people would fight in other countries. So, for instance, soldiers that fought in the West would come back, or even prisoners of war after they were freed from German camps in World War II would go back to Soviet Russia and be put into a gulag because they were exposed to Western ideas, which meant that they were a risk in the country, and just be thrown into a gulag, which is a concentration camp, but, you know, in Siberia, so significantly worse. So would smuggling those people out of those locations be good from the individual perspective, even if they're bad from the communal perspective, at least from the communist perspective?
Yeah, I think it would be good from the individual perspective because you are helping out this person.
Going from a bad situation to a better one, in which case human trafficking would be good.
Right. I know from the point of view of the group, it is bad because you are losing those resources. But in general, I'm used to thinking of people as individuals. And think about from an individual standpoint, okay, this one person, if he goes out and makes a better life for himself somewhere else, well, there's still millions of people left in Russia. I don't think they're going to worry too much.
But I'm going to quote something that definitely is not a communist doctrine. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a cloud be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So in this case, as it would relate to communism, every single person lost is a portion of the whole, and you are losing out. It hurts everyone to lose one individual. And yeah, in this case, it's the communist country as a whole loses that individual and views it as a personal loss, a loss of themselves, particularly in communist or socialist societies that believe that the individual is not paramount, the society is paramount. You are literally killing a portion of what they view as sacred. And in that case, the act of human trafficking, regardless of the intent, I mean, it would be for the intent of the benefit of the individual. That is an inherently evil act. So human trafficking, in that case, would be inherently evil because you're taking it away from a country that believes that the inclusion of those individuals as part of the society, even in the form of a gulag and using them for the exploitation of labor, they would then be lesser as a whole through the act of human trafficking.
But was the whole any good to begin with? If you have people that want to leave so bad that they are going against your belief system, doesn't that say something about the society itself?
From an individualistic perspective, yes. But from a communist perspective, no. So, and individualism versus collectivism is something that we're going to go into in a separate discussion, because that is a heck of a discussion to have. But assuming the axiom of collectivism being the goal, smuggling people out of that, and trafficking however many individuals you traffic out of it, from an individualist, from a communist perspective, assuming those axioms, is bad. You're washing away a portion of the country. The bell tolls for every individual of that country. It is inherently moral under the axiomatic structure of communism. In the case of from the perspective of an individualistic society, you're helping the individuals get from a location that they don't want to, meaning that it's inherently good. So, if your moral structure is based on individual rights and the individual consents, any motion that is consensual to the individual is axiomatically, morally acceptable and good. Even if they're declined in the country that they're going to, the attempt was made because they believe that it is the best decision that they can. And while moving to that country or to a country that doesn't want them and is trying to decline them, it's on the people doing the declining to enforce that. And yeah, you're an individual trying to force your will or force the burden of assisting you on others, but that's what we do every day. That's individuals struggling against other individuals. That's part of individuality in an individual society. So assisting other individuals that you agree with is not inherently immoral, but under the communist doctrine, smuggling people is inherently an individual thing. Or even if you're smuggling a group of people or trafficking a group of people, if it's going away from a communist group, then it is inherently immoral under the communist axioms.
Which is interesting, because this might be a case then where the receiving country isn't the one that can really enforce it. Because a lot of the receiving countries of folks from communist countries are going to be more individualistic. So they're going to see it as, oh, you are trying to come from somewhere that is bad and come here for a better life.
And being poor in some democratic and individualistic societies is arguably better than most modern communist societies.
Exactly.
Or shortly post-communist and partially post-communist in the case of Russia. And that's maybe an argument and discussion on its own of exactly what form of society they have. But the point is, if you're going from a location that's bad to a location that is even arguably has more options, that is good from the individualistic perspective, even if it's negative from the communist perspective.
Exactly.
So if you inherently believe that human trafficking is wrong, the act of human trafficking is wrong, does that mean you're a communist?
I think so.
Well, I didn't expect to have that result. So, hold on, and it's not that human traffickers are communist. That the only way, at least that we've established so far, that you can axiomatically believe that human trafficking itself is bad, assuming that you can consent, that the people being trafficked are consenting to the motion, the only time that you can actually consider that to be immoral is if the people being trafficked are coming from a communist nation and the person doing the interpretation believes that communism is good. So if you believe that communism is good, and that even if the people consent to being trafficked, human trafficking itself is bad and the traffickers should be punished.
That is definitely not what I was expecting.
No, I did not plan to have it go here. I didn't plan to have this conversation go anywhere, but yeah, the other example that it's immoral is if you're using a child who can't consent or fails to consent, and even if an adult consents for them, It's just frequently the case that it's too easy to take advantage of a child or someone who can never really consent and end up growing into just being an enabler of human traffickers. And that use of a child is wrong. But just the trafficking of individuals is only axiomatically wrong in communist societies, because you are washing away a part of the whole and diminishing the entire group. So from a collectivist perspective, I guess more accurately a collectivist perspective, that's the only time that human trafficking is immoral. So to try and sum up in one sentence, assuming that you are not a child and and the people being trafficked consent, that you are not a child being taken advantage of for the purpose of human trafficking solely, and that you are not coming from the perspective of a communist or collectivist ideology, and nor are you being trafficked to a country that has very strict immigration laws or that tends to be xenophobic. Human trafficking is, under most circumstances, inherently good. Whereas sometimes the results, so for instance, slavery may be bad, and human trafficking is frequently associated with that. The act itself is not axiomatically immoral in an individualistic society, because you're trying to do what's good for the individual, and many times, even if they're taking advantage of those opportunities, the parties are consenting, and if they are consenting, it is therefore acceptable.
That sounds good to me. I don't have anything to add.
It doesn't sound good to me, but it sounds axiomatically valid, and that's really the best that we can hope for in the conversations that we're having. That's our goal, is to find things that can be close to axiomatic truths.
Exactly.
And I'm pretty sure we've accomplished that. I'm sincerely hoping that we maybe missed something and something critical that may change the discussion. So if you guys think of anything, absolutely leave it in the comments. We'd be really, really curious to hear what you have to say. This definitely went in a direction that we did not expect.
For sure. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.